Welcome back if you've joined us previously. Today we're going to be talking about how to select and qualify a contract laboratory, particularly as it pertains to the dietary supplement industry. So what we're going to be discussing today are some of the regulatory requirements associated with those laboratories, the criteria that should be applied to a contract laboratory, how to select that contract laboratory, how to qualify that contract laboratory, and then to challenge the testing that you're getting from that laboratory. So we'll begin, as always, with the regulations for dietary supplements, which is 21 CFR 111. That's current good manufacturing practices in manufacturing, packaging, labeling, or holding operations for dietary supplements. And in those regulations, one of the key points is that the quality of a dietary supplement is ensured by demonstrating it meets specifications for 5 things. That's identity, purity, strength, composition, and the lack of any potential contaminants. So the way that this is done is obviously through testing. So we do this at our quality control laboratory. So the quality control laboratory, or QC lab, provides analytical and or microbiological testing for all of our raw materials, including dietary and non-dietary ingredients, any in-process samples that are coming from production, and our final finished products, as well as any environmental samples that are taken throughout the facility. QC labs also provide other services such as analytical methods development and verification, and in the microbiological area they do preservative effectiveness testing and preparatory testing. Some QC labs also have environmental chambers to do storage of stability samples and conduct that testing. And these QC labs can be either in-house, internal, or they can be external through a contract laboratory, and that's what we're going to focus our attention on today. Regardless of where the laboratory is located, in the regulations there are parts A through P, and J is specifically dedicated to laboratory operations. In subpart J, there are 5 major sections that it talks about. So in 111.303, it dictates that we must establish and follow written procedures for all laboratory operations, including written procedures for tests and examinations. In 111.310, it indicates that we have to use adequate laboratory facilities to perform the testing. In 315, there must be established laboratory control processes that have to be reviewed by quality control personnel. And in 320, it specifies that we have to use appropriate scientifically valid test methods. That was the topic of one of our previous webinar discussions that we've had. And then in 325, of course, we must document everything at the time of performance for all the tests and examinations that are being performed. So again, this is in subpart J of the regulations. However, if you look in the regulations and just do a search on different the references for testing and laboratories, all of these indicated here in red, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, K, and N, all talk about testing and make references to the quality control laboratory. So even though the specifics are really in J is actually a very small chapter, there's references to this in many other locations in the regulations. And then things that are also applicable but don't necessarily reference the laboratory also include personnel, which is subpart B, manufacturing operations, subpart K, and O and P for product complaints and records and record keeping. So pretty much all the sections of 21 CFR 111, with the exception of L and M, because A is just the definitions, have something to do with the laboratory. So the laboratory doesn't have to comply with only J, it has to comply with pretty much everything in the GMP regulation. So the contract laboratory, or what is commonly referred to as the CL, is an external third-party laboratory that conducts this analytical microbiological testing for the manufacturer of the dietary supplements. So this testing is conducted typically on behalf of the own-label distributor if you're using a contract laboratory. An OLD is typically a virtual company that uses contractors, either contract manufacturers and contract laboratories, to make their dietary supplements, and they usually don't even have to get their hands on them at all. There's a lot of middle ground, though, where there's a dietary supplement manufacturer and they may use a contract laboratory to do certain types of tests that they're not capable of doing in-house. And then there's even subcontracting contract manufacturers that will subcontract out to laboratories to do their in-process testing. So again, regardless of how they're being contracted, that CL must comply with all those regulations in 21 CFR 111. That said, the OLD, the dietary supplement manufacturer, or the CM, the contract manufacturer, is responsible for ensuring that that contract laboratory does comply with 21 CFR 111. That may seem odd, but the FDA has said that numerous times in warning letters. So this is the reference that you'll see in the warning letters in regards to this. So it indicates that although a firm may contract out certain dietary supplement manufacturing operations, it cannot contract out its ultimate responsibility to ensure that the dietary supplement it places into commerce or causes to be placed into commerce is not adulterated. And that's that section highlighted in red. And then it gives us several references as to why they feel that this is the case. It goes on to say that a firm that contracts out some of its operations must establish systems of production and process controls to ensure the quality of the dietary supplement. So even though the contract laboratory or even a contract manufacturer is doing all the work, the person that contracted with them still has to have some of the same quality systems in order to oversee the operations that are taking place at that contractor. And quality control personnel must ensure that those operations ensure that the quality of the dietary supplement is appropriate. So you have to establish a quality control personnel group at that OLD contract manufacturer or the manufacturer themselves. They still have to do that, and that quality control personnel must review and approve for release all of the data that's coming from that contract laboratory. So you still have oversight over them. All right, so given that, the contract laboratory must be chosen very carefully and must be critically evaluated. This is just not somebody you pull out of a yellow book, right? So some of the criteria that you have to look at is the scientific expertise of the contract laboratory. Make sure they're complying with the GMP requirements. Make sure they have the appropriate quality systems, and they have to be compatible with you. And we're going to talk about each of these. So in terms of scientific expertise, the whole purpose of using a contract laboratory is to seek out their scientific expertise for things that you cannot do in-house. So some of this is one of the most important factors with scientific expertise is the personnel at the laboratory. So these should be educated scientists, depending on the laboratory, it'll be chemists and microbiologists or one or the other. They will have varying degrees, a BS, an MS, or a Ph.D., depending on the level of testing, the type of testing, the level of testing that they're doing. These people will have laboratory experience. We were just talking before we started, I've been in the laboratory since I was 17. So these people have a lot of laboratory experience, so they'll be familiar with the safe use of chemicals, bacteria, yeast, and mold if micro is going on. They'll also be very knowledgeable about laboratory processes. They will be, for people that have higher degrees or have more experience, they will be subject matter experts on specific types of analytical or microbiological techniques. So these are the people that you're wanting to go to. Their scientific, in addition to the personnel, this scientific expertise also goes to their testing methodologies. So there are often multiple types of tests that can be done for a particular analyte or a particular ingredient or product. And many laboratories will specialize in a certain type of testing. So you've heard of like environmental laboratories versus laboratories that specialize in carotenoids or something. So there are certain laboratories that focus on certain testing. That is their area of expertise. So they will have test methods that are indicative of that expertise. So what you want to do is choose the laboratory that has that expertise that you want. Now the test methods, again, I said that there's multiple types of tests. So the test can be either qualitative or quantitative, and all test methods must be scientifically valid. And as we discussed in a previous webinar, which is what was entitled, "What is a scientifically valid method?" the FDA gave us some guidance to that as being accurate, precise, specific for its intended use, and rugged. So as an example of these different types of methods, Let's look at the analysis of folic acid, for example. So folic acid is, of course, a dietary ingredient that would also have a finished product label claim on the supplement facts panel. So there'll be a name for that. So there are multiple ways of analyzing folic acid in either an ingredient or in a finished product. So a few of them are to do a wet chemical titration. There's a microbiological assay that can be done. You can do it using liquid chromatography, or you can do an ELISA, which is an enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. All four of these are qualitative and quantitative, so they can be used in either capacity. But some of the differences between them are the wet chemical analysis is basically just an acid-based titration. So that works great in the raw material because there would be no other acids present. But if there are any other acids present, you will titrate out those first or in conjunction with the folic acid, so this test would not be specific in that type of a sample matrix. So that wouldn't be the method that you would choose. In a microbiological assay, you have good specificity, so you can tell it apart from other types of acids, but the precision is typically poorer in a microbiological method. So depending on the laboratory and depending on the test, they can be up to plus or minus 20%. So that might be too large of a variability in the product that you're looking at. HPLC, or high performance liquid chromatography, has excellent precision and accuracy, but it's a very sophisticated technique. So you might say, well, that's what you should always do, but what that means is there's complex instrumentation, and not all laboratories may have that or have the appropriate controls around that instrumentation or the personnel to operate that type of instrumentation. Another alternative is the ELISA. The ELISA has good precision, but it can be very subject to cross-contamination. You have to flip the plate when you do that, and so sometimes you can have cross-contamination, so your personnel have to be very well equipped and trained to do that, and usually that's microbiological people that are doing that type of technique. The other type of expertise, as we alluded to, is the equipment and instrumentation. A lot of this instrumentation costs a lot of money, and there's a lot of requirements around this instrumentation. So a lot of laboratories will specialize in a certain type of equipment or instrumentation. So various instrumentation, particularly testing systems, can significantly change the capability of the method. So the type of equipment has to be identified and be appropriate for the sample. So as an example, if we're doing the analysis of arsenic in a finished dietary supplement, what's typically done is ICP, inductively coupled plasma. But there's two different types of detection systems that can be used for ICP, either an AES, atomic emission spectrometer, or a mass spectrometer, or an MSD, or an MS. So using an ICP-MS will give you the lowest possible detection limits, and so that's essential if you're doing very low trace analysis or ultra trace analysis. So that would be the piece of equipment that you would want to use if that's the requirement of your test. But an ICP-MS is very expensive, very sophisticated. When you purchase an ICP-MS, and this doesn't include all of the modifications that you may have to make for the facility to handle this ICP-MS, but an ICP-MS will typically cost you about $250,000 as compared to an ICP-AES, which is about half that. So you want to use the piece of equipment that you need, but you don't necessarily have to overkill it. So in addition to their scientific expertise, you're using this laboratory, they have to be compliant with all those regulations, all those subparts of the regulation that we talked about. So in addition to that, they also need to be practicing good laboratory practices, or GLPs. GLPs have been around in the U.S. since about 1978, and it incorporates a set of principles to ensure that all the data that's generated out of the laboratory is uniform, consistent, reliable, reproducible, it's of high quality, and the data has integrity. So that's what you're looking for. So it's a system that any laboratory, regardless whether GMP compliant or not, should be practicing GLP. In addition to that, everything that they're doing has to be documented appropriately, so they have to practice good documentation practices, or GDPs. So this is a set of standards by which all the documents and records are created and maintained to ensure integrity. And I was always taught the 4 C's, so that everything that the laboratory does it has to be clear, concise, correct, and complete. So in addition to the GMP, GLP, and GDPs, all of our acronyms, they have to have a quality system. So quality systems, some of them are involved in these GMP, GLP, and GDPs, but some of them are a little more involved than that. And if we use the terminology from the FDA in their CEDAR guidance for industry on out-of-specification investigations, they use this slogan that any investigation has to be thorough, timely, unbiased, well-documented, and scientifically sound. And I think that's a perfect explanation for what an investigation should be. So that's why I use that reference. So, and this doesn't involve only OOSs. This involves any type of investigatory system or any type of system that is used to control the quality of anything. So this quality system will include an organized documentation system. Typically this is all of our SOPs, but it can also be protocols. It can also apply to master manufacturing records, batch production records, master formulas, all of that. So there will be some sort of organized documentation system for all of that. All of those documents will have to be revision controlled, so that means that only the most current version of the procedure is available for use, and we can track previous procedures to see why it was done differently 3-4 years ago. Any investigations have to be done if there's any variations from that process or procedure, whether intentional or not. So there is a deviation process, and that also has to be investigated appropriately. Out of specifications for test results and examinations. And this also includes out of trends. So even if it's not necessarily out of the specification, it might be just kind of a weird number and you expect it to be a certain number and it's not. So that can be either just out of trend or just weird, aberrant. And then there needs to be a system for how to correct these things when we're finding these. So this is typically your CAPA program, Corrective and Preventative Action Program. So all of these need to be developed with that in mind, to be thorough, timely, unbiased, well-documented, and scientifically sound. The laboratory also has to be compatible with you. So the contract laboratory should have a similar type of mantra, mission, or policies for personnel. The services they provide have to be consistent with what you're looking for. If you're looking for analytical testing, you don't go to a micro lab, so you go to the appropriate facility. So they should have either that be analytical, micro, environmental monitoring, such as air, water, and contact surfaces at the facility. If you're looking for someone to do method development for you, then you need to make sure that they have those services available. And of course, if you're looking for them to do stability testing for you and storage of samples, they need to have appropriate facilities and controls to do that. So these are all the criteria that we have for the laboratory. So how do we find these contract laboratories? So there's a couple of good ideas as to where to look. One is trade organizations. So example is the Natural Product Association. They will have a list of laboratories. The Council for Responsible Nutrition, or CRN, they have them. APA, the American Herbal Product Association, NSF International, those are just a few of the trade organizations that would have some information on laboratories. Another good place to find contract laboratories for the industry is to go to conferences and exhibitions. So at supply side, there's always a group of laboratories that are at supply side. Natural Product Expo is another example. I'm mentioning the Rocky Mountain Dietary Supplement Forum because I'm going to be there next month. So, but those types of conferences and exhibitions will also have some avenues to find contract laboratories. Another place is to find them in scientific publications. If you're looking for a particular test on ICP-MS, for example, and you're looking in a spectrometer spectroscopy journal, and that laboratory was referenced, well, that might be someplace that you'd want to check out. Raw material suppliers are not required to follow GMPs, but a lot of times they are doing testing and they're using certain laboratories, and you can go check them out because they'll have that laboratory listed on their certificate of analysis. And of course, reputation. Let's talk to each other. Once you find a potential laboratory, then you need to do your homework. So you have to do a background investigation of the laboratory. So this is very important that you do this. So you want to look up their regulatory history. So this is actually pretty simple nowadays with the internet. So you can do searches on the various government websites, or even it'd be amazing it's amazing what you can find on even on Google. So, but if you do these types of searches, you look up the FDA website, EPA website, particularly for environmental laboratories. Look at OSHA, see if there's been any issues with the laboratory. The FTC will investigate some of these laboratories as well, or other types of state or local authorities also. And then you can look for certifications. So there's a lot of various certifications that are available for a laboratory. One of these is not necessarily a certificate, but if they're doing testing on controlled substances, they have to get a license from the DEA. The USDA also has a licensing system. A lot of laboratories now are getting ISO 17025 certification, which is general requirements for the competency of testing and calibration laboratories. For micro, it's 7218. NELAP or NELAC is the National Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program that the environmental laboratory arena has adopted and has for a number of years. AOAC has a certification program, and so does the USB. So there's various sources that you can look for that. If they're seeking these types of certifications, that means they are focused on quality, and it's a laboratory that you may want to look into further. This does not mean that they're complying with GMP. These are different types of certifications. You also need to work out the logistics of the laboratory. So you need to make sure that you can communicate with this laboratory and they're capable of meeting the needs that you want. So if you're going to present them with masses of samples in very, very high volume, you need to make sure that that laboratory can handle that and get those turned around to you in TATs and turnaround times that are acceptable. So typical standard turnaround times are 10 business days. You can rush those usually if you want to pay more for it and do it in 5 days, and there's a few tests that you can sometimes even do as expedited within 3 days, but the cost will vary. So just to give you a ballpark idea, it depends greatly on the type of test that you're doing, but in the for analytical types of testing such as HPLC or ICP or GC, it's typically about $250 for a single test. Now, you can certainly get some reduction rates if you have high volumes, but that's typically what it is. And for micro, if you're just doing the basic screen for micro, like a total plate count, yeast and mold, that sort of thing, those typically run you about $50 a piece. So, and again, as I mentioned, that's in your standard 10-day business turnaround time, but you can double that cost if you want to do it in 5 days, or you can triple that cost if they have an expedited service available. And then you need to make sure who is going to be the contact person at the laboratory and who are they going to contact at your company. So you don't want this going into some email box that somebody's like, I don't know why I keep getting these, and they delete those, right? So you want to make sure you've set up the appropriate points of contact for that laboratory if they have any issues, or even when they're just reporting results and you're submitting samples. Most laboratories will have pretty stringent sample submission requirements and how you ship the sample to them and what paperwork has to be received. Typically, it's their paperwork. So you have to make sure that you're following that and know what those requirements are and how the results are going to be delivered. Nowadays, a lot of people have it delivered via email for the results of their tests. So you want to make sure you know what that is and what the report format is. A lot of laboratories will have different types of formats depending on the type of test that's being done. So some laboratories are running food analyses or in different types of industry analyses, and a what is often termed as a GMP report runs you a little bit more money and takes a little bit more time because there's additional reviews and such that have to take place. So make sure you've worked out all that logistical stuff prior to any testing. Once you've established that you are interested in this laboratory and want to do work with this particular laboratory, then you need to set up a couple of agreements. So typically you set up a CDA or confidential disclosure agreement saying that you won't share any information about your products or their services with anyone else. And then I highly recommend that you use a quality agreement. This is a partner for you, and they're doing the testing that is going to release the product into distribution to the public. So you need to make sure that you've established the ground rules of what's going on between you and the laboratory. So this would be all, this would dictate what the qualification requirements are of the laboratory are, that you've aligned your OOS systems with what they're going to do when you hit an out-of-specification investigation, what you're going to do, how you're going to communicate, how you get access to raw data. If you have an FDA inspector come into your facility, they may want to see the HPLC chromatograms from that. Well, you don't have those in-house, so you have to be able to make sure that you can get to that contract laboratory and get those very quickly to show to an FDA inspector. Again, the test report format, you want to make sure you've harmonized units. So sometimes they'll report it in grams versus milligrams, or particularly for vitamin A, vitamin E, IU units versus grams, milligrams per gram, that sort of thing. So you want to make sure you've done all that, because then otherwise you'll have to do an additional calculation once you get the test results. So to qualify the contract laboratory, it's a very important thing to do that, to make sure that you've established that they're meeting all of these criteria requirements and everything is good. So you should have an SOP that talks about how to qualify a contract laboratory. And the quality unit is responsible for doing that and will review and approve all of the qualification requirements. So there are three major parts to the qualification. So one is the contract laboratory questionnaire. So this is a questionnaire that you'll create and submit to the laboratory, and they'll fill out and provide all kinds of information. We're going to go into detail about what that information is and provide that back to you. So that will give you some information on how the laboratory is organized and what procedures they do have and if they're complying with all these GMP requirements. Then you need to go in and do an on-site audit. This is critical, to do an on-site audit of the facility. What is seen on paper is not often the same thing as what's actually happening in practice. So you need to make sure that those two things. And then even when you've done all this, you want to challenge their testing, and we'll talk about that too. And then there'll be periodic requalifications that are required as well. So to come back in and re-audit them or submit them a new questionnaire periodically. So the questionnaire itself is a self-assessment that they fill out with all the background information. So this is used to conduct an initial risk assessment to determine how often do I need to audit them and at what frequency do I need to audit them, or how soon and how frequent, excuse me. So some of the questions that need to be on that questionnaire are their regulatory and audit history. Now, you've already done your background checks, so you already have a pretty decent idea of this, but you want to see what they've got to say about what their regulatory history is. They'll tell you, list all their certifications that we looked at earlier. They'll have information on their laboratory structures, such as their organizational chart, the key personnel, what their education level is and experience level is. Remember, this is the reason you're going there, is for their level of scientific expertise. So you want to know who they have. If you want to evaluate their quality system and regulatory compliance system to make sure it complies with 21 CFR 111. So this is all the sections of subpart J, so that includes the written procedures. So they should have an SOP table of contents. They should have test methods. Sometimes there'll be two different types of SOPs. There'll be the general laboratory SOPs, and then there'll be the specific test methods, or TMs, as they're often called. So you want to see both of those because you want to know what they're capable of doing. An important written procedure in the laboratory is a chemical hygiene plan to make sure that the laboratory is operating safely. The laboratory facility itself, you want to get the 411 on that. So, you know, what's their address, how many years have they been in operation at that location, the ownership, did ownership recently change, what's the size of the facility, what hours do they operate, and how many people are there. You also want to see an equipment list and want to see how do they qualify, calibrate, and maintain all that equipment that they have. And look at the laboratory control processes, particularly key processes such as personnel training, as I mentioned, equipment instrument control, sample tracking. Some of the big labs, they can get thousands of samples submitted to them a day. So you want to make sure that they don't get mixed up with your sample, right? So you need to understand what is their sample tracking system and how do they do that. How do they manage their standards? Everything can be traced back. When you're doing a quantitative analysis, everything traces back to the standard numbers and the standard concentrations. So you have to understand how do they manage all those standards. When they're preparing media or when they're preparing different chemical preparations, how do they do that? How do they control that? Make sure they're not expired, make sure they're the right concentration. How do they review the data? So we're people, so everybody makes some mistakes. You want to make sure that the data has been appropriately reviewed so that none of that is translated into the result that you receive. How do they manage those records? We mentioned earlier, if the FDA comes into your building and wants to see results, those records are housed at the contract laboratory. So you need to be able to get a hold of those, and you need to be able to get a hold of those throughout the allotted period of time. How do they document and organize their paperwork system? What is their change control process for revisions? And often one of the most important things is how do they manage OOS investigations? How do they fix corrections when they need to? How do they investigate deviations and control their deviations? So this is also part of that quality system that is there. So you want to ask all sorts of questions related to these. So typically these questionnaires are numerous pages. So I've seen them up to, I don't know, maybe like 16 or 17 pages. It doesn't have to be that long, but it needs to address all of the appropriate questions that you have. Once you've got the questionnaire then completed, then you can evaluate that, and then you want to go and have an on-site visit and go audit the facility and make sure they comply with all this and all the things they told you that they have. You want to make sure that, in fact, they do and they're following all those procedures. So the questionnaire will help you often decide who is your highest risk lab, and so that's the laboratory you want to do the audit first and the most often. So conducting an on-site audit is costs some money, but it's well worth your money to do that because these are the people that are allowing you to release the product. So these are essential to verify that questionnaire information that I said and that they're meeting GMP, GLP, and GDP policies and processes, and the test methods are actually being followed as they're written. Contract laboratories should be completed prior to the performance of any testing to establish that a dietary supplement has met its specifications. It's been released and distributed to the consumer. So to do this audit, you have to pick out the right auditor. So the auditor that you use has to have expertise in that area. So if you're going to audit a analytical facility or an environmental facility, you should have an auditor that has an environmental background that knows what they're going to be looking at. The same thing for micro. If you're going in to audit a microbiological lab, you want to make sure that the person that's doing that understands how a microbiological lab works. So you should usually plan on about a 2-day visit, depending on the scope of the work that's going to be done and the laboratory itself. It's a very small lab, 2 days might not be necessary. If you don't have this type of person to do this audit in-house, then you need to find one of those. So you hire the appropriate subject matter expert to do this. So that can be a consultant, or somebody else from the contract manufacturer, perhaps, if you're using a contract manufacturer. But you need to find the appropriate SME to do that type of audit for you. Again, the purpose of this audit is mainly to verify the information that they've provided on your questionnaire. If you've got an extensive questionnaire, they've provided you a lot of information and probably a whole bunch of SOPs. So you want to verify all that information. So again, some of the topics that will be discussed is their regulatory and audit history, laboratory certifications. You'll walk through the facility and just observe what the facility looks like, ask their personnel a lot of questions, see the scientific expertise of the personnel, so you want to look at some training records, verify they're complying with all those 21 CFR 111 requirements, and then look at their quality systems, like the OOSs, the CAPAs, the deviations. Look at those systems. This audit also serves as the beginning of your business relationship with them, so it's often the first time you've ever met anybody at the contract laboratory in person. So because of that, it's always a good idea, even if you've had to hire an external subject matter expert, for the manufacturer, the own labor distributor, or the contract manufacturer to be present during the audit. The auditor will run the audit, but that way you get to see how they interact and you get to learn a little bit about their systems, and that will go a long way when you have an OOS investigation or when you're having to work together in the future. So this audit will include an introductory meeting. Usually there's working lunches, and then there's a closeout meeting. So there's a lot of time to interact with them besides just sitting down and looking at records. So it's important for the right people to be there. After the audit, there'll be an audit report that's generated. This should be very thorough and detailed, and it'll be a summary of any observations that were noted during the audit. Also list any necessary corrective and preventative actions in order to proceed with a contract with them. And it may also include recommendations for improvements. These discussions will be had during the audit, and so those will be captured in the report as well. Once we've done all that and we're working with the laboratory, you should challenge the results that they're giving you. So challenge testing may be conducted to evaluate the overall performance of the contract laboratory, as well as provide an indirect assessment of the test method's accuracy, precision, specificity, and ruggedness. Remember, those are the 4 requirements to make sure the test method is scientifically valid. Unfortunately, there are a lot of bad players, or I shouldn't say a lot, there are some bad players in the contract laboratory world that even do what's called dry labbing. So they just totally make it up, and they've never even opened up a bottle of a chemical, right? So hopefully those are rare and far between, but unfortunately that it does occur. You usually do challenge testing can be done either with the knowledge of the contract laboratory or without. I would say a good contract laboratory will know that you're going to probably do that to them, and they will not be offended by that. If they are, that is a red flag. So I was always proud when I was in a contract laboratory and found out after the fact that that was a challenge test, and of course we did just fine. And so they should have no issue with you doing that. So the types of challenge testing, there are 4 kind of types of challenge testing that can be conducted. Inter-laboratory testing, the use of replicates, fortification samples, and blind testing. So inter-laboratory testing is when you submit a single sample, you submit more than one sample to them, but it's from the same initial sample. So basically you split the sample in half and you submit it to them. So the results should be consistent with one another because it's the exact same sample. You should get almost the exact same number within the variability of the method. And you do this to 2 different laboratories. That's why I call it interlaboratory. The trick here when you're doing that, this is often used for microbiological testing. So you'll submit the sample to one laboratory and see what kind of a yeast and mold count they get, and submit it to another laboratory to see what kind of count they get, right? So, but it needs to be the same sample. If it's a different sample, then you're looking at, apples and oranges, so it doesn't do you much good. The trick is that you have to make sure that the methodologies are exactly the same. So you're not looking at variability of the method, you're looking at variability of the lab. Another thing to do is do reps. So you submit multiple samples of the same thing to a single laboratory, and you're kind of looking at the method precision. But they wouldn't know that you're submitting the same thing 3 times. You can just say, these are the samples, I want you to see how much folic acid is in these, and use this test. And you would know what those concentrations should be. They should all be exactly the same. They may not know that. And if they're getting numbers all over the place, that's an indicator something's going on, right? Another thing to do is fortify samples. So you basically take one of your samples and spike it with a known concentration, so you know exactly what the concentration should be, and you submit it to the laboratory for testing, and you evaluate how well they've done based on the % recovery. So if it's supposed to have 10 micrograms or 100 micrograms of folic acid in it, and they get 30 micrograms, something is amiss. If they get 98, all is good. Another way of doing it is through blind testing, to submit a variety of samples with known amounts of analytes to the contract laboratory without telling them what it is, right? They need to know some information. They have to know what test they're performing. They usually like to know what the general concentration range is, because they have to use the appropriate type of technique to do it. But within those parameters, outside of those parameters, you don't tell them anything else. And then they'll have to figure that out, and that's what they're supposed to be doing every time they test your sample, right? So in conclusion, your contract laboratory is a partner, that ensures the quality of the dietary supplement for the 5 important things: identity, purity, strength, composition, and limits of contamination. So it's very critical that you evaluate them closely. So do your homework, do your background check, choose them wisely, qualify them with the questionnaire and a on-site audit, and then you challenge their results. All right, thank you. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to address any questions you may have. First question is, what should you do if your subcontract lab subcontracts out certain testing? That's one of the fun things about the dietary supplement world. We do lots of subcontracting, so it can become very complicated very quickly. This is something that should really be worked out in your quality agreement. If a laboratory that you're using is subcontracting out certain types of tests, and actually many labs do that. So particularly some of your big laboratories like a Covance or, well, we'll just pick on Covance. So like a Covance, for example, they have locations all over the world. So when you go to submit your sample to one location, all of the testing is not being done at that one location. So they're going to subcontract it out to different areas. And some of those laboratories are, they'll be under the banner of Covance, but they're operated by different management entirely. So they're using different systems than the main Covance system. So it's important that you work out who is determining that that laboratory is qualified. So instead of you having to go and do not only the main facility, like the Wisconsin facility for Covance, for example, you also go to their facility in Louisiana, right? So you would have to go to both places if they're doing testing at both places. But you can, in the quality agreement, you can arrange that they're responsible for ensuring that they're meeting, that laboratory that they're subcontracting to is meeting 21 CFR requirements and any other requirements that you might have, and work that out in the quality agreement. So then what you would want to do is make sure that they have the appropriate qualification system for the laboratory, so that they're submitting a questionnaire to them, that they're doing audits of that facility, that they have access to all of those records, and you can get them through them, and that's how you can do that. I generally prefer to, well, of course I'm a control freak, so I prefer to go to the laboratories where I know the testing is being done. So if you're using one of those big laboratories and you know that they're doing the testing in Louisiana or in Washington or in Michigan, wherever they're doing that, you'd want to go to that facility, if at all possible, and check it out yourself and make sure. But you can give that authority to the contract laboratory as long as that was worked out in the quality agreement. And if there was an issue with that laboratory, then you want to make sure you're all in it together, you're partners. So if something happens with that laboratory, your product is subject to all kinds of potential issues, all the way up to potentially a recall. So you want to make sure that that you're comfortable with that laboratory taking care of that subcontractor for you. I should say also that the more contract laboratories that you use, the more complicated the whole thing becomes, right? So you want to minimize the number of contract laboratories you're using, but make sure that you always have a backup if necessary. So if something were to happen with one of your facilities, you would have another option if at all possible.
Thank you, Tara, for another great webinar, and we so appreciate all of the information you've given us in your 5-part dietary supplement series, laboratory series. Our next webinar is on managing FDA inspections. It will be on Wednesday, September 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern, and it will be presented by our senior consultant, Bruce Elsner. For more information, you can visit our website at www.easconsultinggroup.com. And thank you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.